My own family helped my cheating ex take my son away, now he's betrayed them too, and I secretly recorded their desperate confession. Hey, so this is going to be a bit long since there's a lot of background that needs to be covered for everything to make sense. I'm 33 now, and a couple of months ago, I got divorced. But really, the process had been unfolding for almost a year before that. I met my ex-husband, James, when I was 25, introduced to him through some mutual friends. We dated for about 2 years before deciding to move in together and eventually get married. His family leaned on the conservative and traditional side, and they weren't exactly thrilled about the idea of us living together before marriage. So, if we wanted to stay under the same roof, tying the knot was the only real option. But I really liked James, so I didn't see any issue with marrying him. My parents were also completely supportive, so within a year of living together, we made it official. Not long after that, I found out I was pregnant, and we were absolutely overjoyed. It felt like everything was falling into place, the perfect little family coming together. But the happiness didn't last long because as soon as I announced my pregnancy, my in-laws started pushing me to quit my job and focus entirely on being a mother. To make things even more complicated, my job wasn't very flexible when it came to maternity leave. Since I hadn't been with the company for too long, the leave I was entitled to was going to be painfully short. So, I weighed the pros and cons carefully before making a decision. It wasn't something I chose alone, everyone had their say in it. James and his parents kept reassuring me that quitting would be the best choice in the long run. James himself was so confident about it, telling me that he would take care of everything financially, that I wouldn't have to stress over money, and that my only focus should be raising our child. Even my parents and my older brother believed it was the right move. After all, my mom had done the same thing. She had the opportunity to go back to work after having kids but ultimately decided that being home was more important. With pressure coming from both sides of the family, I ended up quitting when I was in my second trimester. At the time, I had complete faith in my husband. I truly believed he wouldn't let me down. That's why I walked away from a promising career to be a stay-at-home mom. But soon after my son was born, I started noticing something was off. Looking back, I realized James had been acting strangely in the last few months of my pregnancy, but at the time, I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. He seemed happy when our son arrived, so I thought things would go back to normal. Instead, they got worse. His temper was short, and anytime I tried to talk to him, he'd snap at me over the smallest things. The only time he actually seemed content was when he was playing with our son. Other than that, it felt like he was constantly annoyed by my presence. He started staying late at work more often, and even on weekends, he always had some excuse to avoid spending time with me. I just didn't understand what was going wrong, but I kept trying to make our marriage work because, unlike him, I still loved him. I didn't want to give up on us. This pattern went on for 2 years after our son was born. James continued staying out late, and even when he was physically home, it was like he wasn't really there with me. I couldn't even bring it up without being shut down. Whenever I tried to talk about it, he'd just tell me how exhausted he was from work and how hard it was being the sole provider. That hurt, because it wasn't like I wasn't capable of earning my own money, I just had to rely on him because he had assured me that I wouldn't need to worry about finances. A few times, I suggested going back to work so we could split expenses, thinking it might take some of the pressure off him. But he acted like I had insulted his manhood, saying it would be a slap in the face to his ability to provide. On top of that, he reminded me that his parents would never approve of it and that we'd have to deal with their disapproval. So, I stayed home, raising our son, the only real source of joy in my life at that point, while James slowly turned into a stranger. Then, about a year ago, I found out the truth. James had been having an affair with a coworker. I had suspected it for a long time but could never find any real proof. I even checked his phone and laptop a few times while he was asleep, but I came up empty. He wrote all his passwords down in a notepad, so I knew them, but even that didn't help. It was like he had nothing to hide, and I started feeling ridiculous for even being suspicious. I even went through his stuff, thinking maybe he had a secret burner phone or something, but again, I found nothing. At one point, I genuinely started believing I was just being paranoid. But the universe had my back because I eventually saw the truth with my own eyes. It was our son's birthday, and we had thrown a big party to celebrate. James had invited the woman he was cheating with, a coworker who was also a single mom with a kid around our son's age. I didn't think much of it at the time. He had mentioned she was a close friend, so it didn't seem odd to me that she was there. After my son cut his birthday cake, I went upstairs to change into something more comfortable. But when I walked into my bedroom, I found James in there along with her. She was sitting on his lap, and they were full on making out. It took me a few moments to even process what I was seeing. First off, the fact that they were in my bedroom was horrifying enough. And second, they didn't even stop when they heard the door open. I had to physically walk over and make my presence known before they finally snapped out of it. I'm pretty sure they thought it was exciting, sneaking around in my house, in my bedroom. Maybe they even got a thrill out of it. But what they hadn't counted on was me completely breaking down right then and there. I'm not proud of how I reacted, but something inside me just shattered in that moment. All the doubts, the suspicions, the gut feelings I had ignored, it all came crashing down at once. And worst of all, it was real. The moment I saw them in my bedroom, something inside me snapped. I didn't even think, I just acted. Before I knew it, I had grabbed James's coworker by the hair and was dragging her out of the room. From what I've been told, James is much stronger than me, but in that moment, he couldn't stop me. I barely remember what happened next because I think I blacked out from sheer rage. I pulled her down the stairs with James trailing behind me, and when we reached the middle of the room right in front of all our guests, I shoved her forward for everyone to see. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know I screamed a lot. I called her every nasty name I could think of and made sure everyone in the house knew what she and James had been doing upstairs. I was so furious that I didn't even register the fact that my son and all his little friends were right there, watching. Looking back, I feel incredibly embarrassed about how I handled it. It was completely inappropriate, but at the time, none of that mattered. All I could feel was betrayal, and all I could do was scream. Both of our families were there, my parents, my brother, my in-laws. I think it was my father who finally managed to calm me down enough to pull me away and take me back upstairs. Once I was in my room, the full weight of everything hit me. I collapsed onto the bed and just sobbed uncontrollably. But instead of staying with me, instead of offering me comfort, my dad did something I never expected. He locked me in my room and walked away. That should have been my first real sign that my parents didn't care about me. Deep down, I had always known that appearances mattered more to them than doing what was right, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. No one checked on me. No one came to see if I was okay. I had no idea what was happening downstairs, and without my phone, I couldn't even reach out to anyone. I just sat there, alone with my thoughts, until hours later, long after midnight, when my brother finally came to let me out. And even then, he didn't ask me how I was doing. Honestly, I think they would have kept me locked up even longer if I hadn't started banging on the door like a lunatic, demanding to be let out. When I stepped into the hallway, the house felt eerily quiet. I asked my brother what had happened after I'd been shut away, and he told me that most of the guests had cleared out right after my meltdown. James had left with his parents and with my son. That left only me, my parents, and my brother in the house. And then came the so-called discussion. Except, in my family, a discussion doesn't actually mean talking things through, it means them telling me exactly what I needed to do to fix the situation. And what they wanted me to do was unthinkable. They told me I needed to apologize. Not just to the guests at the party for my outburst, but also to my in-laws and to James. Apparently, his co-worker had threatened to press charges against me for physically attacking her, and according to my parents, James had done me a favor by convincing her not to. So now, I owed him. Instead of making this a bigger deal, I needed to sit down like a rational person, talk it out, and work through the issues in my marriage. I lost it. I told them all to get the hell out of my house because I wasn't about to sit there and listen to them tell me I needed to apologize to the man who had humiliated me in my own home. The fight that followed was massive. My parents insisted that I owed James another chance, that I had to at least try to salvage the marriage. And when I refused, they hit me with an ultimatum: either I did what they said, or they would cut me off completely. At that point, I had nothing left to lose. I told them to go ahead. I was done. I had finally reached a place where I couldn't care less about what anyone thought. My marriage was over, and there was no saving it. The very next day, I called a lawyer and started the process of filing for divorce. Within a week, the papers were served. And James? He actually had the audacity to be shocked. He came back to the house the day he got served, demanding an explanation. As if he had no idea why I would want to leave him. I made it very clear there was no coming back from what he had done. No amount of apologies or excuses could erase the way he had disrespected me. That conversation quickly turned into a heated argument. We hurled insults at each other, said things we probably shouldn't have, and then he made a promise, one I should have taken more seriously at the time. He looked me right in the eye and swore that I would never see my son again. I thought he was just lashing out, saying something cruel in the heat of the moment. I had no idea he actually meant it. That's when the real fight began. The divorce itself was pretty straightforward. We didn't have too many joint assets to argue over. The house was mine since I had bought it with my own money. The rest of our shared belongings would be sold, and the profits split. Legally, all we had to do was wait out the 6-month mandatory waiting period in our state before finalizing the settlement. But then came the battle over alimony. Since James had pushed me into quitting my job, I had no financial stability. I was starting from scratch, and he thought he could get away with giving me nothing. He actually tried to argue that I wasn't entitled to a single cent. Thankfully, I had saved a few text messages where he had explicitly promised to take care of me and ensure I never had to work again. If not for that, I might not have gotten anything at all. But even though the divorce was emotionally exhausting, it was nothing compared to the custody battle. That's where things got ugly. And that's when I learned just how deep betrayal can cut. James and his lawyer weren't just fighting for custody, they were trying to destroy me. They painted me as an unfit mother, someone completely incapable of taking care of my own child. According to them, I was a raging alcoholic with serious anger issues, a danger to my own son. They even went as far as fabricating stories, claiming I had put my child in harm's way multiple times. None of it was true, but they needed something, anything, to make me look like the bad guy. I thought, at the very least, my own family would stand by me. That no matter what, my parents and my brother would have my back. But I was wrong. Because they turned on me, too. I don't know exactly how it happened, but I can only assume my ex-in-laws bought them out. James's family was filthy rich, and I couldn't think of any other reason why my own blood would betray me like that. Looking back, I suspect they had started cozying up to my in-laws long before the divorce even began, probably hoping to get something out of it. And then, when the moment came, they did the unthinkable. They testified against me in court. They sat there, looked the judge in the eye, and told them that I was an unstable, reckless mother who wasn't fit to raise her own child. And that was the worst betrayal of all. The court ruled that before I could even be allowed near my son again, I needed rehab and intensive therapy. According to them, I was clearly not in my right state of mind, and that was supposedly part of the reason James had cheated, because he was tired of dealing with me. It didn't matter how hard I fought or how good my lawyer was, the odds were stacked against me from the start. We did everything we could, gathering every scrap of evidence to prove that I was a good mother. But in the end, none of it made a difference. The decision was finalized a few months ago, and that was the last time I saw my son in person. The court granted me supervised visitation rights, but it was meaningless. James never actually let me see him. My son is 4 years old now, and I'm terrified that as time goes on, he'll forget about me completely. I do still hear about him from a few relatives who have stuck by my side. My parents and brother? They still get to see him. They post pictures with him all the time, while I'm left on the outside, watching from a distance. James and my son are still living with my in-laws, and as painful as it is to admit, everyone else seems to have full access to him, except me. I can't think of anything more heartbreaking than that. For a long time, I survived off memories, holding on to the belief that at least my son was being taken care of. As much as I hated James, I knew he could provide a stable life for our child, something I wasn't sure I could do on my own. I was starting from scratch, struggling to rebuild the career I had abandoned for marriage. A friend gave me a job at their startup, but like most startups, the pay wasn't great. The team was mostly people in their early 20s just gaining experience before moving on to better opportunities. At my age, it wasn't where I had expected to be financially, but it was something. I did receive alimony, but it wasn't nearly enough to sustain the lifestyle I had been used to. I couldn't just cut costs and live like a college kid. There were responsibilities, bills, and expectations. But at the end of the day, I had no choice. This was my reality now. Still, I kept telling myself that once I got my life together, I could go back to court and fight for shared custody. I just needed time. But then, a few weeks ago, the opportunity to take back control fell right into my lap. After months of radio silence, my parents suddenly reached out to me. At first, I ignored them. But my brother followed up with an email, telling me to come over immediately. He claimed they had realized something important, something I needed to hear. He also said they were tired of keeping secrets and wanted to be part of my life again. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this could be my way back to my son. So that evening, I went to their house. I had expected them to be living comfortably after turning against me for James's family's money. I figured they'd be well taken care of. But when I got there, it was the opposite. If anything, their situation had worsened. The only bright spot of the visit was seeing my son. He was so happy to see me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a little bit of warmth in my chest. But that moment was short-lived because, as soon as I walked through the door, my parents practically fell at my feet, begging for forgiveness. According to them, they had finally realized how badly they had screwed up. They knew there was no undoing what they had done, but they still wanted me to forgive them. That's when they told me the truth. After my divorce, when my parents and brother went to James and his family to collect the money they had been promised, James laughed in their faces. Turns out, there had never been a formal agreement. My parents had assumed they would be compensated handsomely for testifying against me, but there was nothing in writing. No contract, no guarantee, just empty promises. And when they threatened to go back on their statements and tell me everything, James made sure they kept their mouths shut. He told them that if they tried to help me, they would never see my son again. So, for the sake of keeping their grandson in their lives, they stayed silent, even though they had been completely used. But it didn't stop there. James and his family hadn't just manipulated them, they had turned them into free babysitters. Every single day, James would drop my son off at my parents' house and leave them to take care of him. And they had no choice but to comply, even when it was inconvenient. My dad and my brother both had jobs, and my mom, who was getting older, couldn't handle everything alone. Either my dad or my brother had to work from home every day just to help take care of my son. It was wearing them down, and they were desperate for a way out. That's why they had called me. And, in true form, they wanted something in return. They told me that if I paid them the money James's family had promised, they would take my side this time. They would go to court and testify that they had been pressured and coerced into lying about me the first time. They swore they would help me win custody of my son for a price. Honestly? I wasn't even surprised. My family had always been materialistic. And now that my dad's business had failed and they were back to working for other people, they needed money more than ever. My father had been hoping to retire, but he had no savings left because he had poured everything into his failed business. Now, they were desperate. They even tried to strategize with me, saying they could spin the story in court, make it sound like they had been forced to testify against me so they wouldn't be charged with perjury. What they didn't realize? I didn't need their help. Because the second I had stepped foot into their house, I had started recording. I knew something shady was going on, and I wasn't about to walk into it blindly. Every single word they said was caught on tape. Of course, I played along. I told them to send me any screenshots or proof they had of James and his family manipulating them. I acted like I was considering their offer. And then I left. I had already seen my son. And now, I had everything I needed to go back to court. The very next day, I went to my lawyer and filed for custody again. This time, I was ready. The case is still ongoing, but one thing is certain, I now have the evidence to prove that James and my family had lied about everything. I've already played the recordings in court, and it has completely shifted the tide in my favor. This time, I'm not losing. James and his lawyer are scrambling, desperately trying to find anything they can use against me, and honestly, I'm enjoying every second of it. This is exactly what they put me through last time, and now the tables have turned. It's karma in its purest form, and I couldn't be happier watching it unfold. The only thing that's been less than ideal is their latest argument. They're claiming that I used them just like James did and that I had no right to record our conversation without their consent. But in my state, those recordings are completely legal and admissible in court, so their complaints mean nothing. It wasn't until they started throwing around words like betrayal that I fully grasped what they were getting at. They felt like I had violated their trust by recording them. Bold words coming from the very people who turned their backs on me first. They genuinely believed what they did was justified because they had needed the money, while my actions were unforgivable because, according to them, I had no reason to screw them over and put them at risk of perjury. They insisted that since they had already agreed to help me testify against James and his family, there had been no need for me to go behind their backs. They'd been bombarding me with texts, trying to guilt me into feeling bad about what I did. And honestly, it's getting harder to ignore. So, am I the bad guy for exposing them and putting them at risk of perjury? No. Update 1. The custody case is still ongoing, and James and his lawyer are fighting tooth and nail to prove they were telling the truth, because now they're facing real consequences. If convicted, they could be looking at felony charges and possible jail time. But honestly, that's not my problem. I don't even know why I wasted time feeling bad for my parents in the first place when they clearly didn't care about me when it was my life being torn apart. At this point, it's just tit for tat. They made their choices, and now they're dealing with the fallout. After reading through a lot of comments and really reflecting on everything, I've come to see my parents for what they truly are, entitled. And I want nothing more to do with them. I've cut ties with all of them. Let them go wherever they want. Let them fend for themselves. I don't care anymore. The only thing that matters is getting my son back. I've waited long enough, and I refuse to let my so-called family continue manipulating me. If they were willing to sell me out for money, then there's no reason I should feel obligated to show them any loyalty now. Update 2. I did it. I finally got custody of my son. I don't think I've ever felt this level of happiness in my entire life. And if that wasn't enough, there's more good news. James, his family, and my own parents and brother have all been charged with perjury. And yes, they might actually go to jail for it. I bet they're all regretting everything now. But I don't care. None of that matters to me. The only thing I ever wanted was my son, and now he's with me, where he belongs. James is still trying to fight the charges, scrambling to keep himself out of jail, but I doubt it'll work. I've also filed for a restraining order against all of them. The threatening text messages I've been receiving make it painfully obvious that they're the ones behind them. No one else has a reason to come after me like this, so I'm not taking any chances. The past few weeks have been chaotic, but now that things are settling down, I've decided to slow down too. I want to spend as much time as possible with my son, so I'm planning to cut back my work hours. I've even considered selling the house and moving to a smaller apartment just to save more money and start fresh. But as happy as I am, I know the real work isn't over yet. Rebuilding my relationship with my son isn't going to be easy. Even though he's happy to be with me, he still asks about his dad and his grandparents. I never know what to say. He's told me bits and pieces about what life was like living with them, and none of it sounds good. Apparently, he spent most of his time with his grandparents, while James and my in-laws only gave him attention when it was convenient for them. And every time I ask how he felt about living there, he makes a face and says it wasn't that great. He's just a little boy, but even he picked up on the constant fighting and the fact that no one really wanted to take responsibility for him. It breaks my heart knowing he was treated like that. But thankfully, I don't have to worry about it anymore. Because now, he's with me. Update 3. Hi everyone. I can't believe I'm back here after almost 5 years. It feels surreal just how much my life has changed. 5 years is a long time, and so much has happened. The biggest change? My son is growing up. We have a beautiful relationship now. After countless therapy sessions and years of healing, we've finally become the mother and son we were always meant to be. He's growing into a wonderful young man, and I know without a doubt that he will never turn out like his father. I can feel it in my heart. He's 9 years old now, and already a perfect little gentleman. I'm raising him on my own with full custody because James? He gave up. After serving his sentence, he packed his bags and moved to Europe. Just like that. He left and never looked back. He ran away with the same woman he had cheated on me with, and now they're married. And as horrifying as this sounds, it seems like he simply replaced our son with her kid. It's sickening, but honestly, not surprising. That's exactly the kind of man he is. As for my parents and my brother, they got out of jail after 6 months for good behavior. We have not spoken since. They didn't even try to reach out after they were released, and I am grateful for that. I wouldn't have had anything to say to them anyway. I don't know anything about my in-laws. I haven't heard from them or about them in years. And I prefer it that way. I've moved on. I have a stable job now, and by God's grace, life turned out better than I ever expected. I'm still working at the same company I started with, my friend's business, and it has grown into something amazing. My son and I? We have everything we need. And for that, I am truly, truly grateful.